So sort of counterintuitively, the last several weeks of Easter have us reading stories about what Jesus said on the night before he died. It's sort of counterintuitive because we read all this stuff during Lent, and most of us, especially if we are pastors, figure that Lent is way over by now. Why are we still reading these things? But actually, the words that Jesus said on the night before he died are really actually an important part of Easter as well. And that's because Jesus was talking to his disciples on the night before he died about how they were going to live as his risen people after his resurrection. They probably did not hear those words in that way on that night. And we probably don't hear them that way when we read them during Holy Week. But hey, it's Easter and we get another shot at them. And today's gospel reading is part of the last things that Jesus said to his disciples on the night in which he was betrayed. And he says this to his disciples at the end of today's gospel reading: I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You should love one another. But he goes on and he says, by loving one another, everyone will know that you are my disciples. And this is not just one of the many things that Jesus taught his disciples in a random sermon. This is Jesus' parting instruction. And remember, these are not simply words to remember Jesus by. These are marching orders for his disciples, as they will now live as representatives of his resurrection. They are the words that tell us and told them how we would be known as disciples of the risen and living Lord. So these are actually words we should pay really careful attention to. And sometimes when they don't seem real complex, it's just love each other. That's we go, okay, yeah, right, that's one of those background things, and we miss it. But these are really important words because he says, by this, everybody's going to know you as my disciples. And Jesus could have said a lot of other things. He could have said, everyone will know you are my disciples if you have the most correct and perfect theology. You will be so wise that everyone will recognize God by your perfect theology, but he didn't say that. He could have said, everyone will know you are my disciples because you are the most morally righteous people around. And you are so perfect and holy that everyone will know you are mine. But that's not what he said either. And he could have said, everyone will know you are my disciples because you are the most successful and popular group in town, because people will say, hey, they are so good and so successful, there must be something there. But that's not what Jesus said. He didn't say any of those things. And it's not as though Jesus was endorsing bad theology or immoral behavior or making a virtue out of failure. But in the end, Jesus was saying that if we want people to understand and identify us as disciples of the living and risen Lord, then it's going to be our love for each other that's going to make the difference. And it won't matter at all if we have great theology and great morals and we're successful if we don't have that love for one another. That was the kind of love that God was showing for us when Jesus died for us. And if we don't reflect that kind of love, nothing else is going to make a difference. So it's important also to remember when Jesus talks about love, I know I have beaten this drum before, but it's an important drum, so I'm going to beat it again. There are 3 words for love in the New Testament. The first word for love is eros, from which we get the word erotic. It's the kind of like, I'm so in love with you. That is not the word that Jesus uses here. The other word is philios, from which we get the word, like the name Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. It means you're my buddy, you're my pal, I like hanging out with you, you're really nice. That is not the word that Jesus uses here. He uses the word agape. Agape means self-giving love. It's the kind of love that says, I'm going to run out into the street, push you out of the way of an oncoming car, even if it means that I get run over. That's the kind of love Jesus is talking about. That's the kind of love God has for us. And that's what Jesus says is the kind of love we should reflect in our dealings with one another. He says, that's unusual in the world, and that is what's going to make you known as my disciples. So why is this self-giving love so important? Maybe it's because self-giving love is always focused on the other and never on the self. And one of the best definitions of sin that I have ever heard is sin is about being turned in on oneself. When I make something all about me instead of about God and instead of about my neighbor. And often, really good, otherwise good, moral, religious people can become really inwardly focused and make religion about them when they get too hung up on the correctness of their theology or their own good behavior or their own success at doing what they think God wants them to do. That was certainly the case in Jesus' day, even sometimes among his own disciples. And many Christians throughout the centuries, even today, can get caught up in doing things that really make Christianity about ourselves. And that can happen whenever we forget that reflecting God's self-giving love is actually the most important task of the church. And instead, we start to speak and act as though faithfulness in Jesus were defined by our perfect theology. Which is why sometimes people end up speaking about even different denominations as different religions. I cannot tell you how many times I've talked to people where I've said something like, well, I'm a Lutheran pastor. Oh, I was an Episcopalian, but then I changed religion and became a Methodist. It's like, no, you didn't change religion. You changed denomination. We're all part of it. But when we talk about each other as though we were so radically different because we do not agree on all the little itty-bitty pieces of doctrine, what we project to other people who are not Christians is that this is all about ourselves. This is all about arguing about our own little ideas instead of being about Jesus. Sometimes Christians get caught up today when they think that being a Christian is really about moral righteousness. And it's good to be righteous and it's good to do things that are right. But sometimes Christians have nothing to do with each other. If you are not on the right side, if you are not on the same side as I am of some important social or political issue, how can you possibly be a Christian? I mean, you can't be a Christian if you're not on the right side of this. And Christians on both the left and the right have done this to each other and said, if you don't believe, if you're not on the right side, you cannot be a Christian. And that makes people who are not Christians say, yeah, you know what? This is all about a social and political movement. It is not really about Jesus. And sometimes Christians make Christianity about us when we define Christianity by our own ability to be successful. Which is why sometimes Christians get more hung up on how many people have you brought to Christ or how well is our church doing. Because somehow or other, if you're doing it right, you must be successful, and that ends up being the defining moment of whether or not you're being a Christian. Instead of, are you actively, truly sharing God's self-giving love in your dealings with one another and in your dealings with people outside the church? That's what makes people recognize disciples of Jesus. That's what's supposed to make people recognize us as disciples of Jesus, when we actually live differently because we actually believe in the resurrection. See, in his final instruction to his disciples, Jesus reminded them, and he reminds us, that our primary job as disciples is to reflect his love in the lives of others. And when we get too hung up on our good theology or our own righteousness or our own success or lack thereof, other people who aren't Christians will simply think that our religion is really about us and not about God's love for everyone in Jesus. And even though good theology, and hey, I studied theology, I like good theology, even though good theology and good morality and successful strategies for reaching out to others, they are all good things. Jesus reminds us again today that these are not the things that will help others to know that we are really disciples of Jesus. They will not show people the resurrection. Instead, it's by reflecting God's self-giving love in Jesus that everybody will know that we are all about Jesus not about ourselves. It's by reflecting God's self-giving love in Jesus that we show the world that we're actually willing to live a different way because we believe that Jesus is risen. And it's when we reflect Jesus' self-giving love in the lives of others that we show the world that the resurrection is not simply an ancient story we talk about, but it's a present, living reality in our lives that we put into action each and every day.